I really hate doing things twice when I did it right the first time. I made this video earlier this morning. Unfortunately, I made it while I was driving, so when I played the video back, all I heard was this incessant loud rattling of my car on the highway. And it was truly disgusting to listen to. The product was fine, the packaging was generic. So hopefully I'll find the patience to get through this diatribe again. With that being said, I guess let's just move on. What is genevolution? Genevolution is a contemporary approach to resolving scientific myth with scientific method. In this case, the scientific myth is the Genesis story. The scientific method is the theory of evolution. Genevolution does not seek. Genevolution does not seek to say one is right, the other is wrong, doesn't side with one or the other. In fact, it attempts to do something more blasphemous than that. That being, it seeks a compromise. It says, I'm looking at the Genesis story, and I'm looking at the theory of evolution, and I don't want to battle with either one of them. I don't want to choose either one of them. They're both marvelous. In their own right, they are both marvelous. But somehow I still want to be able to find a resolution where I can have an approach to both of them and not feel like I have to side. And that being, or my resolution is through a contemporary approach rather than a modern approach or a traditional approach. Maybe it's just the American inside of me. It wants to resolve Eastern and Western philosophy in a Western hemispherical, context. What is genevolution? Genevolution looks at the theory of evolution. Genevolution takes the story of the Genesis, not the entire story of the Genesis, rather the first few chapters from about the time of the creation until the time of maybe right up until the banishment or the banishment. And sees that as a story within itself before it gets into genealogy and the Great Flood. It just looks at that initial few chapters, I think like chapter 2, maybe, chapter 2 through, I can't remember which chapter it goes through, but it just looks at that as a separate entity, for a Genesis within a Genesis story. And it looks to interpret it with poetic license, to not take it for face value, to kind of accept that possibly those people who came up with the story didn't have sheets and sheaves of paper to write out. Maybe they just had some little piece of block and that they said, okay, here you go, write all of humanity onto this, onto this initial, small, whatever. I'm rambling. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to draw out of it with the same kind of licenses that we use and same kind of, interpretation that we use with any other type of literature, where it means something more, even though it's, it's a myth, it's a story. It's to not, devalue it, to not unmarvelize it. simply because, you know, we have issues with religion, whatever that means. No, I think it's truly a marvelous story. But what makes it marvelous is how accurate it is. How truly, truly accurate it is. And if you can see it, or if you can understand, like maybe I do, maybe it might mean something more to you as well, than it just being some kind of fairy tale mythology. As far as evolution goes, if you're watching this video, you probably have a good idea of the process. You've probably seen the evolutional time chart, the little man growing to being the full Homo sapien. You've more than likely read Charles Darwin. I haven't. I have no clue what's in that book. Like I say, like I will never attest that I have any type of genius intellect into either of these matters. Only that I am trying to resolve, both cases. So how do I think that they both hint at each other? Well, I think I have to go back a step. Because what I'm seeking not so much is how we came up with 10 fingers or how evolution made us look the way that we are today. I'm not looking for that because I believe it. You know, there's enough case studies out there to kind of show a progression that tells a story, a scientific story of evolution. You can see it out there. There's enough evidence. There's enough proof. You know, I don't believe it's all made up. I don't think it was just all put there to be kind of a mystery for man to ponder over. I think that it all occurred. I'm not looking for that. What I'm looking for, because I mean that part I understand, but what I'm looking for is the introduction of divinity. The introduction of divinity within humans. And by divinity, I mean the very this very obvious fact that we are so much more intelligent than any other animal species on this planet, regardless of what you think of humanity, regardless of what you think about how truly intelligent we are, or how you think that animals may have more. No. If you can't look around you, and if you cannot recognize how far ahead of we are than any other animal species on this planet, any other life form on this planet, then you probably have a real problem, you know? I mean, yes, we do mimic ourselves after animal kingdoms. You know, people might say, well, you know, humans are like a colony of ants or a pack of dogs, pride of lions, murder of crows, however you want to see it. Yes, okay, you know, there are limits to human imagination. Of course we're going to mimic, but it's not to say that our intellect or our divinity is on the same level as those that we are mimicking. No. We are truly divine compared to them. So, evolution does not explain, how we came to have, I call it divinity. And I'll probably continue to call it divinity. Human divinity, however you want to name it. And I believe that I have a resolution for that. question, or I had to come to a resolution from that question. I sat and I thought about it for a long time because it's a very good question. It's a pertinent question. I mean, wouldn't you want to know? So rather than having the two battle against each other, I sat them down, interacted with them both, and I made my own conclusions. My conclusion is that divinity, or what we call divinity, is really an evolution of questions within the human intellect. Not to say that these questions came all at once, but they were a slow progression. They came little by little over eons. But as we had each awakening, the time frame between the awakenings became shorter. Now, I don't think that this was all I don't think evolution was unfocused. I don't think it was self-propelled. I don't think that man just evolved into I don't believe humans evolved on their own. And not to say that the environment didn't play a factor on there, but I believe there was a very specific catalyst or catalysts that propelled humans to awaken their mind into what I might say is a third dimension. And I believe these catalysts I believe one of the greatest catalysts is in the Genesis story. It's the mythical fruit of the Garden of Eden, the one that God says not to eat from. I believe that humans ate of this fruit, and by eating of this fruit, they awoke to a third dimension. So the question is, what is this fruit? What is this mythical fruit? If you know what this mythical fruit is, then quite possibly you might have an answer. You might have an answer as to why evolution occurred, or you might be able to resolve it. Sorry, I'm rambling again. I kind of tend to get off on losing my train of thought. It happens. I mean, I'm dumb. I'm not stupid, but I'm not quick-witted either. It takes me a while to get from point A to point Z. Okay, so back to the fruit. What is the fruit? Okay, what is this fruit that we ate that made us so smart? Okay. Some people say it's an apple. Others people say it's a pomegranate. I once thought it might have been just, being carnivorous. Maybe when we became carnivores, something happened. No. I now think I have a good idea of what this fruit is. And I think that this fruit is mentioned more than any other fruit within the Bible. And the fruit that I am talking about, let's see, somebody coming out? Alright, I'm all paranoid. The fruit that I'm talking about is grain. Grain. Known to you and me as wheat, rice, maize / corn, sorghum, barley, oats, millet. I'm not sure if I said rye. But it's basically a family of fruit. If you look up, I believe, I can't say the word, Poacaea, Poachaea. I don't know how to say this. This family, this grass family, or if you want to look up Caryopsis, Caryopsis, you'll find that grain is actually a fruit. It surprised me. Yeah, I didn't think of corn as a fruit or wheat as a fruit, but it is. It's a very special fruit. And what makes it special is that biologically the seed and the hull are fused together. So rather than like other fruits where you have a seed and then the outside, the fruit, the hull, which are very distinct from each other, you have, with grain, you have one entity, one all entity, all-encompassing, all-developed entity, where there is no like separation between what's inside the seed and what's on the outside. So yes, I do believe grain is the mythical fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, you may say like, well, why would you think grain is the knowledge of good, the knowledge of evil? Well, because grain produces oil, and grain produces alcohol. And in that case, sorry, let me start again. I believe that the knowledge of good is wisdom. The knowledge of evil is will, or maybe willpower. And wisdom, I think, is best represented, signified by oil. Just think of oil. Just think of the historical significance of oil and wisdom. Just together, just tied together. Just even if you look in the Bible, look up oil, the uses of oil. And then the knowledge of evil. Well, if you want to argue that alcohol and evil have not been tied together throughout the course of history, well then, I don't know, that might be a very blank argument to have. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I do believe that, sorry, I lost my train of thought again. So, what do I think happened? How do I think the story occurred? How do I come to that conclusion? Okay. Well, if you're familiar with the story of Genesis, it begins with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, I don't know where we were along the human evolution timeline. I don't know what our shape and form was. I don't know how long ago it was. Was it 2.5 million years ago? Was it more? Was it less? But what I believe happened to the earliest species is that they came into an awakening of, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I believe they came to this conclusion, or not this conclusion, how am I trying to say this? I said it earlier, but I can't remember how I said it. Well, at the onset of the story, one second. Sorry about that. Do you ever get to a point where you just don't feel like talking anymore? Alright. Okay, so the first awakening. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We've established that part. So what does this signify? Yeah, earliest man, I don't believe that the first awakening was catalyzed by grain. I tend to think it may have been a vegetable, something that may have been that early humans, I don't know if they derived a hallucinogen or just maybe a very primitive or a very simple or very basic oil/alcohol fruit. I tend to believe that the first awakening might have come from the cucumber family, squashes, I think pumpkins, things like this. I don't know what they would have been back in those days, so if I just use squash or pumpkin, it's only because I'm very dumb as to what that family was back in the day. I tend to think there may have been a hallucinogen to it, because I believe what happens is, and I think what in the story, the Genesis story is saying, is that the first awakening was time-spatial relationships within the intellect. In the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. So, like I mentioned earlier, or didn't mention earlier, I've done these videos so many times today I can't remember. We have this evolution of questions, and the first set of questions that I believe that was asked by primitive man are the first set of questions that we ask when we're born, and that is when and where. Now, this is to neglect the other 4 questions. Just when and where. That's all we knew. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. Where? For this example, I'm going to use an imaginary child. And in this case, an imaginary, at this time is a baby. It's purely imaginary. So we have a newborn, fairly newborn. And just like them, the first questions they seem to comprehend or grasp are when and where. When I cry, people attend to me. Think of the game of peekaboo when you play with a child. You're basically playing a where question with the child. Where am I? Now I'm hidden. But these kind of questions seem to man, I must be fading. They're the first questions that our imaginary child or imaginary baby or seems to cling to, when and where. And that's best represented by, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Sorry if I'm repeating myself here. So yeah, I believe that over eons, this very limited, maybe, I don't know if it's a product of this plant, slowly developed the intellect. Now, obviously, there was not bakeries or breweries millennia ago or eons ago. So you have to ask, how did you process this? How did you process and make, for example, let's just say our squash food or squash vegetable into something that was going to grow the mind? You just ate it and it made you smarter? No. It's a very slow process that I believe came through breastfeeding, through mother's milk. I believe that woman was the force that was pushing evolution along. Whatever form and shape we were back in that day, there was obviously a woman, and she would go out and she would eat the squash, and then she would go back to her child and she would breastfeed it. And now what she ate had been processed through her body. and she was giving it to her child. Well, through that process right there, I believe is what started to slowly grow the human intellect. I think that breastfeeding was the process that pushed along this sort of divinity, or this evolution towards what we know now, or how we know now. And this happened for eons. It happened for a long, very, very long time. I think it took a long time was because I don't think they derived as much from, let's say, our squash. I don't think that they derived as much from it. But even though it was a slow trickle, it still had its effect, over time. Now we move on to the second awakening. And I believe that what happened was that we found a new food source. It was a little bit more complex than our squash. Actually, I want to go back before that. I want to go back to when we were talking just a minute ago about the first awakening. What I want to just kind of add or append to that part is that at this point in time, I believe that early humans or early primates, or however we're called, had almost an infant's intellect. And even though we think now of infants as being very, well, not as smart as we are, obviously. I mean, they don't have the same type of knowledge that we do. But I believe even with that limited intellect it was far superior than what any other animal might have had at that time. Because just being able to ask those questions is a survival adaptability that is far superior. It gives you a much more advantage over the other animals. You're still subjected to natural selection. You're still subjected to, gene flows and what was the other? There's 4 factors. There's gene flows, natural selections, and mutations, and then I think there's gene outputs. I can't remember them all right now. You're still subject to all that. That's all part of the environment. But still, even with that infantile intellect, you have a survival advantage over other species that's gonna, as long as you have the numbers to support it, you should be able to, and obviously we did, continue on the evolutionary timeline. So that's where I wanted to come to the second awakening after I had said that piece, because I just wanted to address that. Yeah, it was an infantile intellect, and infantile intellect relative to our own intellect. There's, a comparative difference, but infantile intellect compared to, a frog's intellect is, there's obviously a big gap there too. All right, so now we're at the second awakening. Humans have moved on. Not to say they moved on, but what I think happened is, like most primates, maybe, I don't want to say societies, but civilizations, you have a tendency to have a kind of tribal mentality, where you have maybe a dominance between a dominant male and dominant female in their court, and this king and queen of these little tribes or whoever seem to always get the lion's share of the squash. And just like any other animal documentary you've seen, there's always the meek. There's always like a meek woman, who doesn't get the lion's share, who's always seems to be castigated from the court, who seems to have to scrounge for not her survival, because I don't believe woman's survival is supreme in her mind, but more so than that is the survival of her child. I believe maybe innate to woman is survival of the child is much more important than survival of the self. So this woman has to go out and find other food sources for her child, because she's not getting a portion of the lion's share. She's getting much less than that. So where does she go? She goes into where it's dangerous. She goes into the water. Or maybe the water is now a part of the environment. Maybe there's a natural catastrophe where she must go into the water to find food. And what does she find in the water? A more complex nut to crack. Rather than cracking a big squash or pumpkin, now she's going to start cracking something that's more difficult, which is legumes, beans. And from what I understand is that a lot of times you can find these legumes in lagoons or bodies of water. And it's frightening to go into the water. But I think woman was brave enough to do it. And that's why there's such an affinity for artistic works of woman by the water. Venus on the half shell, those Japanese pearl divers. There's always some kind of connection between woman and water that I just don't get. But it may have been something along an occurrence along our evolutionary line. And I think that what happened is they did go into the water, and they found this food source, and they had to seek, to stave off the perils of the sea beasts, of the water beasts, and I believe they ate these legumes, and the legumes, once again, processing it through their body, they and feeding it to their child through mother's milk, they evolved the next set of questions, which is what and who. Now, in the story of Genesis, this is at the point where Adam is going around naming everything. He's giving everything a what title. What is this? Oh, that's a cheetah. Oh, that's an elephant. That's a giraffe. That's a rock. That's a snake. That's a dung beetle, He's going around answering all these questions of what. But then we also get to the point in the story where he answers the question of who, which is very significant and very different from what. And he answers who because Eve tells him, I am your wife. I'm not a what. I am a who, I'm not a label, I guess. I don't know how to explain it entirely, but there is so much self-identification. There's so much identification when you understand yourself as not a what, but as a who, I know the whole story about how Eve is, a lesser partner of Adam. I don't think it's that. I think basically the conversation was that he says, what is that? And he says, oh, that's a woman. She says, no, I may be a woman, but I'm also a wife. And he's like, well, what's a wife? And she's like, it's a who, I'm a Eve. What's a Eve? That's who I am. But you're a woman. Well, I'm more than that. I am who? I'm Eve. So I don't think it was kind of a lesser, fact that Eve came second or anything like that. I think it was just that maybe after he understood, or humans understood what the concept of who came to them, and using our imaginary baby as a reference, this is now they're into toddlerisms, and they are asking questions beyond when and where. They are asking questions of what and who. What's that? And they're talking a little bit more, like dog, cat, chair, But then you also ask them, who is this? They'll say mama, papa, brother, sister. And I believe that we carried around this type of intellect for the next series of years, however long that lasted. I don't know where we are entirely on the evolutionary timeline. But obviously now we're asking 4 questions. When, where, what, and who. And just like they said, the meek will inherit the earth. If you have the meek who have been consuming this product, now they're getting smarter than the ones that are just eating the squashes all the time. And now they can outthink them because they have a more exponential way of surviving, of adaptability, because being able to question these 4 aspects is really, really going to push us ahead of the rest of the animals. Our divinity is growing. I would call it, even though it's a second awakening, I believe it's more like also a second dimension within the human mind. And I believe that's what happened during this part of the Genesis story. I think that's what's being interpreted out of it. That's what I think it's trying to tell us. So we go on like that for years of asking these 4 questions, just like any other animal that might learn sign language nowadays. And then we get to the part of the story where we ask, or where Eve eats from the mythical fruit of the Garden of Eden, which I consider to be grain. Now, as far as this goes, I don't know what happened. I don't know if Zeus threw down a thunderbolt, set a field of wheat on fire. I don't know if Hephaestion stole, and I don't know if it's even Hephaestion or I can't remember who it was. It's a Greek mythological story about someone who takes fire and brings it down to humans and gives it to them. I don't know how that goes. I think what it might be trying to say is that we started to cook our food. I don't know if it means that we were carnivorous at this point. I don't know. That part's still a mystery to me. I'm not that smart. But I do believe we get into cooking our food because obviously you're going to have to cook wheat. You're going to have to grind it up. You're going to have to process it. But you're going to also have to have the intellect to work with it, to unlock it. So we've gone from our squash, which is easily cracked, whose matrix is easily cracked, to legumes, which is a little bit more difficult to crack, to grain, which is the most complex thing that we have cracked to date. I'm not going to get into a certain type of plant that we're trying to evolve right now. I'll just leave that one up to your own imagination. I'll just stay with grain as the last fruit that our last awakening. At this point in the story, we're getting closer towards the end of the Genesis story, or the initial chapter. So what happens is Eve, or the woman, eats grain, and her eyes are opened, and she sees that she's naked. And right there is pretty much the knowledge of good, as far as her eyes being open, which is an eye-opening experience, which is wisdom. And she saw that she was naked. She had this will to understand herself in a shameful way, and that was more of a knowledge of evil. And in that sentence, that compound sentence, I believe it's saying it itself that Eve saw her eyes were open, and she saw she was naked. She had the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil. And she obviously shared it with man. Again, I say she used, I think it was through breastfeeding. And it may have been maybe let's say 100,000 years ago, maybe 150, I don't know, somewhere along those lines. So she started to eat this fruit, and he eventually mind had evolved and it had grown as well alongside of hers until now they could unlock the final set of questions, which was how and why. You know, the pair of questions that all these other primates I don't believe can answer. They could all answer who, what, when, and where. They could sign language that to you all day long. But you ask them why is the sky blue or how are babies made, just like our imaginary child would at the at a the age of I don't know 4 or 5 when they have an actual grasp of once their mind has kind of grown to conceptualize the ideology between of these two questions, these two major questions. By asking, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought again. Man, it's getting tired. I can only talk for so long. Yeah, so how and why? Yeah. I don't know which one is, I think how might be the knowledge of good and why might be the knowledge of evil. Don't know. Since it seems to me that like with why questions, there's always kind of a downward spiral where how questions always seem to want to resolve them or to look for a true answer. I don't know. It's debatable. Still, I think that once as a child you get to the point where you can answer these quiet type of questions, you've kind of reached the third awakening, the third dimension of your mind. Now, are there questions beyond this? People would say, well, like, oh, there's would questions and should questions. And I kind of see those maybe as proof that we're going to evolve further. I kind of think of it like I think of the color scheme, where you're told that there's 7 colors, but every time you look at violet, you seem to just see purple. People tell you there's a violet. Sorry, they killed the lights on me. I guess I'll do the rest of this in the dark. Okay, where was I at? Oh yeah, violet. So I think that rather than concerning myself if we're going to grow wings or horns out of our head or who knows what, I think the evolution that we should really be considering is what's going to happen to our intellect or into our mind. Will we receive a fourth awakening? Will we be able to ask 2 more questions? Will we be able to see violet as a very distinct and just a very distinct color that doesn't even represent, it doesn't even look like purple to us? And will we be able to see an 8th color, because that's what's really missing. Human imagination has limits. There's boundaries to how much you can imagine. And if you don't believe me, you explain to me an 8th color. Imagine an 8th color. I'm not talking about black or white or brown or gray or any of those colors. Imagine an 8th color for me. An actual vivid color. Something along the lines of red and yellow and, one of these type of colors. And maybe if we're able to see a 7th and 8th color, maybe we'll know that we've evolved. And when I hear questions like should and would, sometimes I think they fall into that violet area. But then I also have to ask myself, are these just variations on when, where, what, who, why, and how? Are they just another way or a different way of asking them? But for now, I put them into the violet category. As for the banishment, I'm not really. If anything interests me about the banishment, it's their clothing. It's how they went from leaves to actually, clothing themselves with hides. I don't know if this was some kind of change in weather or a signifier of a change in weather from a very tropical or just hot condition to something that was more frigid or cold, where they had to cover themselves. But now they could answer the question, you know, how do I keep myself warm? Obviously, that kind of survival aspect is going to allow them to travel all over the planet. And wherever they go on the planet, they're going to find this mythical fruit, They travel out of Africa, they're going to find wheat, and then they're going to find rice, and then they're going to find sorghum, oats, rye, and eventually they'll get to corn or maize. And this is going to sustain them, and it's going to... But this is one thing that I believe in. Oh, that's right. There is this part where God in the story comes down and talks to them. And when he talks to them, he goes, oh, you've been eating the fruit. And I think that this may be interpreted out to tell us that grain is a major reason why we can talk, or why we have this type of speech that we have today. I believe that, wheat, rice, corn, whatever, is the reason why we are able to have such complex for now, speech. I don't think it was just something that we developed. I think what happened was when, basically, if you're staying within the context of the story, God knows that if you eat of this fruit, it makes you talk, and then he comes down and says, hey, how come you're all wearing clothes? And you answer, well, wait a minute, the only reason why you can talk is if you've been eating from that fruit. I think it's a way of saying that those fruits, as they evolved, also evolved our speech. I'm probably completely wrong on that point, but I think it would be worth the effort to put the evolution of grain next to the evolution of humans and see not how they rival each other, but how they complement each other. Because from my understanding, grain, at one point, like an ear of corn, would have only produced a few kernels, whereas now we know a whole cob of corn, a whole cob of kernels. I don't think that rice used to produce what it produces now. So I think it would be very key to look at how grain evolved and how humans evolved side by side. I'm getting towards the 50-minute mark. I think I only had about 55 minutes left. So I might be close to kind of concluding this. Because I don't know if there's anything more I can add to it at this point. So I think I'm going to move more into a summary mode now. So with genevolution, I was looking at taking the Genesis story, which I call scientific myth or artistic myth, interpreting out of it, because I had also took the theory of evolution and what I knew of evolution and took out of it, and kind of resolved them together to see if maybe they complemented each other, just like humans and grain did. I believe that evolution is not merely just a physiological aspect, which obviously everything seems to be subjected to on this planet. But I think the evolution that we're thinking of is the divine evolution, which is only really understood when we understand the evolution of questions, how just questioning gives us such an advanced survival advantage, but it also allows us to move from just a very concentrated area, living maybe like in Africa, but it also gives us a survival ability to move beyond that, and now to the point where we're traveling off of the planet. I believe that the questions came to us in series of awakenings. I tend to think, I mean, they may have come to us one by one, but I tend to think of them as coming to us in pairs, um, just because we seem to think of them in pairs, when and where, the earliest time spatial relationships are, just how we learn in our first dimension. In our second dimension, it's more about relationships, um, maybe relationships and relativity, I don't know, where we're asking what and who. Um, and then in our third dimension of questioning of how and why, um, which is I don't know what this gap, I wouldn't know how to label this third dimension. But I know that each one of us is it's a tool for us. Each dimension is a tool for us that gives us a survival advantage, and obviously is pretty much allows us civilization. And in that sense, I'd also like to point out that throughout human history, there has not been any civilization that did not have grain as a staple product. As a staple crop, I mean, to the point where religions were based on it. Earliest religions, they understood somehow, somewhere, grain was talking to them and saying, I'm the reason why you're as smart as you are, the god of corn or the god of wheat or god of rice, And then also think about grain in your dietary. Most people try to avoid it now. They don't like the carbohydrates. They all want protein. But you have to remember that the recommended daily allowance has a substantial portion set aside for grains and cereals. And if you starve yourself of grains and cereals, you're damaging your human intellect. There is a reason why, if you're not giving your child, for example, breast milk, you are giving them a grain or a cereal, formula in the very beginning because you want that human intellect to take. You want it to take hold. So I'm going to end here for now. If I ever come to a point where I feel there's more to add to it, I will. But I think that pretty much I've covered the premise. It would have been something I would have liked to have written out into an actual hypothesis. Unfortunately, my ability to write is very limited. I don't have the patience for it. Thankfully, somebody invented YouTube. So on that note, I will say good night before I lose my train of thought for the umpteenth time. And I wish you all the best dreams.